Maybe you can start by telling us what explosive weapons are.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Explosive weapons are a subset of what is referred to as conventional weapons and are being used by national military forces and non-state armed groups. Technologically speaking, there are many types of explosive weapons. They can include anything from aircraft bombs, artillery shells, missile and rocket warheads, or even landmines and improvised explosive devices, all of which are activated by detonation of a high explosive substance. Different technical features dictate the precision and explosive effect, but generally these weapons create a blast and fragmentation zone that makes their use highly consequential for civilian well-being and infrastructure, particularly if used in populated areas.
So these types of weapons are not necessarily new. Why is their use a problem?
These weapons were originally designed for use in open battlefield, but when used in populated areas, they're often indiscriminate because of the large destruction radius, the inaccuracy of the system, and the delivery of multiple munitions over a wide area. When explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 90% of the victims are civilians. Their use in cities, towns, and villages causes thousands of civilian casualties around the world each year and continues to be one of the greatest threats to civilians during armed conflict. Today, we estimate that there's about 50 million people suffering from the horrific consequences of urban warfare, and this number will only continue to grow if explosive weapons continue to be used in populated areas. It's also important to note that civilian suffering, which includes death and injury, is not the end-all and the be-all. The reverberating effects of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas can cause long-lasting harm and psychological trauma to victims, with high levels of explosive ordnance contamination, which will continue to kill and injure civilians years after the fighting has stopped. They also hamper reconstruction efforts and thus having a direct negative impact towards achieving sustainable development. And it denies individuals their full enjoyment of their human rights.
And what has the response of the international community been?
Well, for over 10 years, the United Nations Secretary General has used his voice in good offices to express serious concerns over the humanitarian impact of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and continues to call on member states and all parties to conflict, both national armed forces and non-state armed groups, to avoid using explosive weapons in populated areas and to ultimately take combat out of urban areas altogether. So in our world today, where we see the international disarmament system under severe strain, it is crucial that states come together and reaffirm their commitment to observing international law and strengthen their commitment to abiding by international humanitarian law. This is what makes an achievement like this declaration all the more important and significant. The declaration is a result of truly collective efforts of states, the ICRC, the United Nations system, and civil society. It's an important contribution to the international rules-based order and a milestone for efforts to advance humanitarian disarmament and curb human suffering during armed conflict. It also sets international standards for restricting and refraining from the use of explosive weapons and commits states to reviewing and adapting their military policies and practices to reflect operational realities and humanitarian concerns in order to fully comply with international humanitarian law. But perhaps most importantly, it sends a clear message that using explosive weapons in populated areas causes unacceptable civilian suffering and devastation that must stop. If and when fully effectively implemented, the declaration has the potential to significantly strengthen the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas.